morning, friends. Welcome to our A Step Back in Time program this morning. This month in our series, we are taking some short stories and excerpts from the book, The 20-Minute Whistle, and it was also a book written by George Beard Coffman. If you recall, several months ago, we read from his book, The Lilac Bush, and I think everybody enjoyed that. This book has more to do with the industrial development and the names behind that here in Waynesboro. And as we're reading some of the excerpts, you will hear the names and recognize the names of George Frick, Peter Geiser, Franklin Landis, and Abraham Landis. So today we're going to just go ahead and read from chapter 2, and it does talk about the history of the nation as well as local history. So probably none of you remember this, but maybe you recall stories as told from family, friends, or family in the past. So chapter 2. John Adams was now president of the United States of America. Some inventions of worth were showing up. Eli Whitney invented a contraption to pick the seeds from cotton in 1793. It was the turmoil of the French Revolution that caused the DuPont family to immigrate to America in 1800. While Irene was out hunting one day, an incident occurred that led to the formation of the DuPont Company. In firing his gun, Irene was shocked to discover that the powder was of such poor quality that as often as not it failed to discharge at all. Irene was a chemist, and he knew the method of making black powder. To settlers, gunpowder was essential. After some discussion with his father and with the President Thomas Jefferson as to the attitude of the government, he made plans for a powder plant. A site was brought to the Brandywine Creek near Wilmington, Delaware, and the DuPont Company was in business. Daniel Boone had led a group of settlers through the Cumberland Gap in 1775, just a few weeks before the Battle of Concord on April 19th. The shot heard round the world. Boone lived to see millions pour across the mountains and found the states of Kentucky in 1792 and Tennessee in 1796. During Thomas Jefferson's presidency, Ohio was admitted as a state in 1802, Indiana in 1800, Michigan in 1805, and Illinois in 1809. Coal was first used for heating and cooking in Philadelphia in 1812. Homes were lighted by candles in grist mills, and factories were operated by water power. Robert Fulton grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in the late 1700s, and in his travels visited France. He had lots of curiosity and an inventive type of mind. He had been working on a boat that would be moved by steam. He built one in France, and it was not a success, but he brought the steam engine to New York and installed it in a boat, which he had constructed, and tried it out on the Hudson River. The Clermont, as the little vessel was called, went up the river to Albany in August 1807. Before Fulton's death, many steamboats were in use. In 1819, the first steamer crossed the Atlantic Ocean. It was the Savannah, which sailed from Savannah, Georgia, for England. The ship also had sails, so it was pretty much sure of getting to its destination. For a long time, only paddle wheels were used until the screw propeller was invented by John Ericsson. Citizens in the larger towns didn't bathe regularly, especially in winter, and as a result, to suffer from scabies, ringworm, miscellaneous other itches, lice, and body odor. It was not just the lower classes, but everybody, including the members of the courts of Europe. The valley, the Cumberland Valley, was coming gradually out of its frontier atmosphere. The growing villages of Greencastle and Mercersburg were directly west of Waynesboro, and there was now a running road east and west between the towns, as well as over the mountains to the east toward Baltimore town. The year 1826 arrived, and on July 4th, former presidents John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died, just 50 years to the day after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The year 1826 is also noted for the births of George Frick and Peter Geiser. Andrew Jackson was elected President of the United States in 1828. He was the first man who had risen from the poorest in the land to the highest office. He thought, and very many of his countrymen thought with him, that he represented the whole people better than any other former president. Until he was elected, it seemed to be almost a requirement for the job that one be a member of the Virginia aristocracy. Until he was elected, it seemed to be almost a requirement for the job that one must be a member of the Virginia aristocracy, or the Adams family. President Jackson at times wore his famous four-lens spectacles, which gave him lateral vision, 2 lenses forward and 1 on each side. Cyrus McCormick's Reaper changed the agricultural methods of the nation in 1831. When George Frick was 9 years of age, his father, Abraham, decided to leave their home in Lancaster County and head west to a farm previously purchased from John W. Winger in the Cumberland Valley, just north of Quincy, which in turn is just north of Waynesboro, a village of 500 or 600 inhabitants. When they reached the Susquehanna River, they were ferried across by John Wright, as there was no bridge. They traveled with their families and other animals across York and Adams counties. It was 1835, just 10 years after the first turnpike had passed through Waynesboro, running east and west. They may have traveled by the railroad cars as far as Carlisle, and then down the Cumberland Valley by horse and wagon, since the railroad reached Carlisle from Harrisburg in 1835, Chambersburg in 1837, and Greencastle 4 years later. George's father had a mechanical turn of mind and used this ability in making various devices to make life easier around the farm. As George's life developed, it looked as though he had inherited some of his father's curiosity and skill. Peter Geiser was born on a farm near Smithsburg, Maryland, 9 miles south of Waynesboro. He grew up with plenty of boys and girls around him. There were 5 girls and 7 boys in the family. Their mother was of the Singer sewing machine people. Each child did their share of the work, which went with living on the farm. Peter became interested in the use of tools and what he could do with them in the workshops on the 2nd floor of their pig pen. He early accumulated an axe, an auger, a chisel, and a hammer. Around the age of 15, he kept thinking of the way grain was tramped on the barn floor. He had little schooling. His workshop was very small, and his health was not so good. His father permitted him to apprentice himself to a carpenter in Smithsburg, following which he moved to Hagerstown to work as a carpenter from a contractor. He then had a spell of sickness which kept him from work for 18 months. Gradually, he became stronger and went back to work, and since his father had purchased a nearby farm, he gained a larger workshop. In his carpentering, he came up with an idea that permitted less handling of materials due to his method of measuring and fitting joints. George Frick received a common school education at a subscription school in Quincy Township, as the public school system of Pennsylvania had not then been inaugurated. He was good at arithmetic and helped his father around their sawmill. In 1843, when 17, he apprenticed himself to Martin Kendig, a millwright living at Ridgeville. He did so well that Mr. Kendig turned much of the work over to George, who after 2 years left to start a repair shop at his home near Quincy. There were many grist or flour mills at the time, and he was called often to keep them in good running condition. And on several occasions, his work took him into the Valley of Virginia. After several years as a millwright, he moved to the old mill property on Antietam Creek, then owned by Mrs. Anson W. Good, which is at Good's Dam. Hans Good arrived from Europe and settled in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. His son, General Jacob Good, and his wife Barbara traveled west and settled near Leitersburg, Maryland, and their descendants are plentiful in the Cumberland Valley, including those at Good's Dam, just south of Wallacestown. The general died in 1797. Samuel F.B. Morris came up with the idea of an instrument for transmitting messages by electric impulse sent through a wire. It developed into the telegraph, and the first line was built between Baltimore and Washington and put into use May 25, 1844. It was not many years before there were telegraph lines over all civilized lands, An alphabetic system was used in telegraphy, in which letters were represented by dots and dashes. The method became known as the Morse code. And that's our reading for today. We heard a little bit about Mr. Frick and Mr. Geiser. Join us again next week when we look at another chapter in the book, and let's see what else we can find out about the industrial history here in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. So until next time, keep researching. Let us know if you find something that would be interesting for us to share here in our program, A Step Back in Time. Thanks for joining us.